So the Nintendo Switch Lite rumors were right. Well, some of the Nintendo Switch Lite rumors were right. There were a lot of them. A broken clock's right twice a day. Semantics. Either way, the Nintendo Switch Lite is real and it's coming very soon. As always with a Nintendo hardware announcement, some people are confused, some people are angry, others may say downright pissed that Nintendo is choosing to release a pared down version of the Nintendo Switch rather than an upgraded version. But there's a crazy amount of precedent for this sort of thing, and that's what I want to explore today. Let's talk about all of Nintendo's hardware releases and subsequent revisions that followed. Originally beginning development in 1980, Famicom was conceptualized as a more affordable alternative to the offerings from companies like Atari and Mattel, being priced at $199.99, while also being more advanced. They even originally considered going straight to a 16-bit processor, but decided against it to stay inexpensive. This was the first of many designs for the Famicom, with the second being their first attempt to bring the Famicom to the West in the form of the Nintendo Enhanced Video System, which was originally going to be in partnership with Atari until the deal fell apart due to Atari believing Nintendo licensed Donkey Kong for the Coleco Adam home computer, despite the fact that Atari had exclusive computer rights to the game at the time. They ended up being wrong, but I digress. That deal fell through. So rather than moving forward with the Nintendo Enhanced Video System, they went with the Nintendo Advanced Video System because legal issues are a thing. At any rate, the AWS wasn't just a reskin of the Famicom. As many of us know, the gaming market crashed. And as we also know, retailers weren't very into the idea of stocking a video game console in their stores as a result. So Nintendo decided to rework the Famicom's design into the AWS, which was marketed as a home computer, to throw retailers off of the game console scent, and was supposed to be bundled with a cassette recorder, coding software, and a keyboard amongst other accessories like a joystick, zapper, and wireless controller. It's worth noting that Famicom did eventually get most of these products, but the AWS never officially saw the light of day due to retailers opting not to order any of these systems from Nintendo. But like I said, some of the accessories for the AWS did see the light of day for the Famicom and eventually the Nintendo Entertainment System as well. NES ultimately ended up being a lot more simplified than the AWS was, with its less boxy design, the lack of bundled keyboard, no wireless controllers, and as far as differences from the Famicom specifically go, a front-loading cartridge slot, detachable controllers, the obvious color scheme, and the bundled-in ROM for $199 US. And now that I mention it, I want to make clear that I'll mostly be going from the perspective of the US launches for these consoles, because I'm from the US, so it's easier for me to verify all of this information. Apart from this, Nintendo did a bunch of add-ons for the Famicom that don't really fall under the category of redesign, with the exception of one revision that was oddly manufactured by Sharp and called the Sharp Twin Famicom, which is a Famicom with the disk system add-on built in. And just so we can keep the focus on hardware revisions and be relatively neat about it, I'll talk about the 101 models for the Famicom and NES now instead of after SNES when they launched, which were more compact as well as an efficient way to transition NES to top-loaded carts due to pretty widespread hardware failures related to the front-loading form factor. This came about a year after SNES was already released, and more than anything served as what the 3DS does now, being a cheap entry point into console gaming for parents to get kids they didn't feel confident buying the newest and most expensive home console, with this new NES model only costing $49.99. All told, the NES and Famicom sold a combined 62 million units worldwide. The trend that Nintendo set up until this point was pretty much only to release hardware revisions when they needed to fix a glaring hardware issue, which is something that I wouldn't say Switch really suffers from. But moving forward, we will see more of Nintendo releasing consoles that are along the lines of the cheaper cost-cutting measures and also quality of life improvements like the Switch Lite. And with that, on to Game Boy. Game Boy was created to double down on the stranglehold Nintendo had on the gaming market by once again undercutting the competition, retailing for only $89.99 at launch, while simultaneously creating pocketable hardware that was more durable and software that was more compelling in the form of Tetris and later Super Mario Land, and even later than that, Pokemon. Game Boy also is the first platform that Nintendo went all in on hardware iterations, including the Game Boy Pocket. Apart from the obvious improvement being its more compact form factor, the Game Boy Pocket used 2 AAA batteries rather than the 4 AA batteries the OG Game Boy took, and had roughly the same battery life. A new black and white display in favor of the original's green screen, which significantly reduced the ghosting issues, as well as 7 different colored SKUs, being red, green, blue, clear, silver, and pink, for $59.99. In April of 1998, Nintendo released the Game Boy Lite in Japan only, and I mention this because it had the major innovation for Nintendo handhelds, that was the introduction of a backlight. Retailing for $69.99 on October 21st, 1998, the Game Boy Color was released. Much like the other iterations, has one of its major new features in its name, being the increased color palette. Also, like the Game Boy Pocket, it came in 7 different colors: clear purple, purple, red, blue, green, yellow, and silver for the Pokemon edition. In addition to that, Game Boy Color also boasted an overclocked processor and more RAM as a response to developers voicing displeasure with the limitations of the original Game Boy lineup of consoles. The Game Boy line sold a combined 119 million units worldwide. In 1990, Nintendo released the Super Famicom in Japan with a significant boost over the original Famicom. Not only because of its 16-bit processor running at double the clock speed, but also a megabyte of RAM compared to 2 kilobytes of RAM in the Famicom, and a half a megabyte of video RAM compared to 2 kilobytes, which all allowed for a big jump in graphics and the complexity in games that could be produced. I'd say many of which stand toe-to-toe with modern standouts like Super Meat Boy, Shovel Knight, or Celeste. This after Sega beat them to the 16-bit era by more than 2 years with the release of the Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis, in the United States. This didn't affect the launch of the Super Famicom much in Japan because it was technically superior to the Mega Drive in most aspects, but when the Super Nintendo Entertainment System launched in the US, priced at $199 by the way, the marketing team over at Sega of America were able to make the Sega Genesis a more appealing package for the American audience by marketing to the teenage demographic with edgier marketing campaigns that called into question Nintendo's family-friendly strategy. At the end of the day, the Sega Genesis was ultimately still beat out by the Super Nintendo, with its total lifetime sales racking up to 49 million units sold worldwide. Helped in small part at the very end of its life cycle by the only hardware revision that Nintendo made for the SNES, the SNES 101, which was meant to fill that affordable price point space that Nintendo likes to fill, like they did with the NES 101. In this case, $99.95, sans the fixing of any glaring hardware flaw like the one found in the front-facing NES. The year before this though, in the summer of 1996, the Nintendo 64 was released worldwide for $199.99. The history of this console, like the last one, begins with the bitter war between Nintendo and Sega, who were both approached by American computer hardware manufacturer Silicon Graphics Inc. Both Sega and Nintendo were approached by SGI with their pitch for a partnership. SGI wanted to start producing their tech for a wider audience by way of consumer products. Sega claims they turned it down because the tech wasn't in a state that they felt comfortable with until it was too late. Nintendo claimed that they were the chosen partner because they were the more attractive business partner, since they allowed SGI to license their tech out to other companies, while Sega wanted exclusive rights, which admittedly sounds odd considering Nintendo's reputation in this era of gaming. Long story short, Nintendo 64 was yet another massive jump. I'd argue the biggest hardware jump in demonstrable hardware capabilities that we've seen even to this day. It has a 64-bit processor, as the name suggests. That processor is clocked at 62.5 MHz. There's 4 megabytes of RAM. Unlike the other consoles I talked about though, the N64 didn't get a real hardware revision, just different colored and special edition SKUs post-launch. But it did see a bit of an upgrade through the expansion pack, which added another 4 megabytes of RAM. Also, the 64DD or disk drive was released in a very limited quantity in Japan. This was also Nintendo's way of dipping another toe in online gaming, which, side note, I'm thinking about dedicating a full video to the history of Nintendo's online services across all their consoles dating back to the Famicom. Let me know in the comments if that's something that you would be interested in. And as always, clicking the like button lets me know that you guys like videos like this, so while you're doing that, why not click that like button as well. Besides, the 64DD didn't really stick around for long. There were only 9 games released, so it's not really worth talking about right now anyway. Speaking of not worth talking about, Virtual Boy happened technically the year before N64, but this segue wouldn't have worked if I talked about it before now. Moving on. Game Boy Advanced was released in the first half of 2001 for $99.99. It's a 32-bit handheld that was in development for a long time. Work on a successor to the Game Boy Color dates all the way back to 1996 with a prototype they ultimately shelved because of the stranglehold the original Game Boy line still had on the market. Talks of a successor popped back up 3 years later at Nintendo's trade show Space World, and that materialized into the GBA. The Game Boy Advance was on a cosmetic level landscape compared to the original Game Boy line's portrait layout. It had a larger, higher resolution screen that supported a higher color range, but it came in slightly less colors, which were Arctic, Black, Orange, Fuchsia, Glacier, and Indigo. On a technical level, like I mentioned, it has a 32-bit processor clocked at 16.78 MHz, a secondary processor used to support backward compatibility with Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, 32 kilobytes of internal RAM, 256 kilobytes of external RAM, and 96 kilobytes of VRAM. The original GBA had what most would agree with in retrospect was a major flaw for a handheld released in 2001. The screen wasn't actively lit and it still required AA batteries. So, in early 2003, Nintendo released the Game Boy Advance SP, which stands for Special, to rectify these issues with its front lit screen and built-in rechargeable battery. Also, they changed the form factor back to a portrait format and introduced the clamshell design, which they continue to use for the dedicated handhelds to this day with the bulk of the 3DS line. But I'll get to that. The GBA SP launched in Cobalt, Platinum, Onyx, and Flame Red, which all retailed for $99.99 and was impressively responsible for 43.57 million units of the 81.51 million units the Game Boy Advance family sold as a whole to date. That number was also in part because of the SP later receiving a bit of a revision of its own 2 years after its release, sporting a brighter, now backlit screen. It came in 2 colors at launch, Pearl Blue and Graphite. That same year, the final GBA revision, the Game Boy Micro, was released. It also came in 2 colors, black and silver, and also retailed for $99.99. I'm not entirely sure why the Game Boy Micro exists. It didn't really serve an actual purpose other than being incredibly small, but people like it, I hear, so whatever, I guess. Later in 2001, the same year the GBA came out, the Nintendo Gamecube was released for $199.99. This was the first Nintendo console that largely dropped the boasting of computing bits as a marketing tactic. Besides, of course, Mario 128 that they showed off to press at reveal events. Specs-wise, the Gamecube has an IBM PowerPC Gecko CPU clocked at 486 MHz, an ATI Flipper GPU clocked at 162 MHz, and 24 megabytes of RAM. I'd say this console was similar to the 16-bit era, being more of a perfection of the goal of the last platform than it is anything revolutionary. GameCube sold 21.74 million units worldwide. And I guess they figured they nailed it first time at bat because GameCube has no hardware revisions. Not any akin to the ones that we've been talking about here anyway. Released holiday 2004 for $149.99, Nintendo DS, which stands for dual screen or developer system according to Nintendo, was created after former Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi had an idea for a dual screen console akin to the Game & Watch. On the subject of the hardware, I know the DS has a lot of colors available, but it only launched in titanium. As far as specs go, the DS has 2 CPUs, an ARM9 processor clocked at 67 MHz, an ARM7 processor clocked at 33 MHz, 4 megabytes of RAM, 256 6 kilobytes of internal storage, a Gameboy Advanced slot, sort of, and for the first time ever, a resistive touchscreen as well as built-in Wi-Fi capabilities. It was positioned by Nintendo as a third pillar to their console and existing handheld on the market. The claim was that they still intended to support all three of these consoles simultaneously. Sound familiar? Obviously, this didn't end up happening, but I'd say it makes sense that they felt it was necessary to hedge their bets given the massive success of the Game Boy brand and the relative failure of the Gamecube. Venturing out from that was risky for sure, and Yamauchi knew it, famously being quoted as saying, "If the DS succeeds, we will rise to heaven, but if it fails, we will sink to hell." Luckily, the Nintendo DS had massive success, being in close contention with PS2 for the title of best-selling video game hardware of all time. Lifetime sales to date being over 154 million units sold worldwide. It did this in part with the support of several hardware revisions released by Nintendo, the most that Nintendo has ever released up until 3DS, which we'll get to. The first of these revisions, the Nintendo DS Lite, was the one that really set the tempo for the DS line, selling over 90 million units on its own. By the summer of 2006, it was launched with 3 colors: crystal white, ice blue, and enamel navy. This revision was sleeker, had a brighter backlit screen, a longer lasting battery, and it would be the last DS with backwards compatibility with the Game Boy line. There was a planned larger model of DS Lite, but like with the Game Boy Color, Nintendo chose to shelf it due to DS Lite's original momentum. They did, however, use it as a basis for the next revision, the Nintendo DSi, which has a larger display, 2 cameras, one front-facing, one back-facing, 256 megabytes of internal storage, support for up to 32 gigabytes of external storage via its SD card slot, which was used to store media like photos taken with the built-in camera and content on the new DSi shop, its exclusive digital storefront for games, another first for Nintendo at the time. It also expanded their support for the wireless encryption standard for Wi-Fi. Then, the final revision, the Nintendo DSi XL, or LL in Japan, which, as you'd expect, was a DSi with larger screens and also an increased battery life. Next up is the Wii, Nintendo's most successful home console to date, launching in holiday of 2006 for $249.99. This, in my mind, was the beginning of the era that Nintendo still struggles to escape from as far as brand recognition goes, because they chose to opt out of the console hardware specs race this generation. Instead, Nintendo chose to focus on the experience of playing the games instead of the tech behind them. But for the sake of consistency, the hardware of the Wii, launched only in white, has a PowerPC Broadway CPU clocked at 729 MHz, an ATI Hollywood GPU clocked at 243 MHz, 88 megabytes of RAM, 512 megabytes of internal storage, and support for up to 32 gigabytes of external storage via SD. The Wii has the distinction of being the first Nintendo home console with backwards compatibility thanks to their move to disc-based media, so it also has slots for up to 4 Gamecube controllers and 2 Gamecube memory cards. The Wii had 2 hardware revisions, the RVL 101, which had no backwards compatibility with Gamecube and no stand, and the Wii Mini, or RVL 201, which is similar to the RVL 101, but in addition to what it removed, they also swapped out the disk drive for a cheaper top-loaded disk drive. I can't for the life of me find the launch price for the RVL 101, but the Wii Mini was released for $99.99. Regardless, the Wii sold a combined 102.85 million units worldwide. In spring of 2011, Nintendo released the 3DS in 2 different colored SKUs, the Cosmo Black model and Aqua Blue, for $249.99. They quickly officially lowered this price because $249.99 is way too much to be paying for a 3DS. 3DS was originally heavily marketed for its titular 3D gaming capabilities, as it was a budding trend at the time, but it ended up really being supported by the games that were created for it, none of which relied too much on the 3D tech due to the possible effect the glasses free stereoscopic 3D could have on young children's eyes. Also, I mean, some people don't even have depth perception, so there's that. The hardware specs of the 3DS are as follows. It yet again has 2 CPUs, one of which being a dual-core ARM11 MP core clocked at 268 MHz and a single-core ARM9, 128 megabytes of RAM, 6 megabytes of VRAM, 2 gigabytes of solid-state storage, an included 2 gigabyte SD card with support for up to 32 gigabytes officially. Also, like the DSi, the 3DS has front and back-facing cameras, only this time there are 2 back-facing cameras which are used to take 3D pictures and video. Like I mentioned before, 3DS saw a lot of hardware revisions, the first of which was the Nintendo 3DS XL, which, like the DSi XL, had a significantly larger screen and increased battery life. 3DS XL launched for $199 US in the summer of 2012. The next revision was Nintendo 2DS, which, as the name suggests, stripped out the 3D capabilities as well as the clamshell design that had become synonymous with Nintendo handhelds up until that point. This is another hardware revision that I would put in the Switch Lite category, being that it was created to be an entry-level console for younger players, especially in this case since every 3DS game has a cautionary disclaimer for players under the age of 7 on the box. It's worth noting that the 2DS wasn't released in Japan for years after its launch in the other major regions, but when it did release in all of those other regions, 2DS came in two colors, Crimson Red and Electric Blue. It was priced at $129.99. By early 2015, Nintendo released the new Nintendo 3DS and the new Nintendo 3DS XL, which was the only one released in the US officially, and it came in new black as well as new red for $199.99. This is the first Nintendo hardware revision that I would say is akin to the mid-generation PlayStation 4 style upgrade that people thought that Nintendo Switch would get around this time with the rumored Nintendo Switch Pro. And no, I don't mean the stealth update that is now rumored, I mean the old rumor that was rumored around the time when Nintendo Switch Lite was rumored initially. This means I gotta do specs again since they are notably different. New Nintendo 3DS has an ARM11 MP Core quad-core CPU clocked at 804 MHz, a DMP Pika 200 GPU clocked at 204 MHz, 256 MB of RAM, 84 MB of which is dedicated to the OS, and 10 MB of VRAM. In addition to that, it had a new sensor that detects the angle you are viewing the screen from to produce a more stable 3D effect, and it doubles as an ambient light sensor. A C-stick nub thing for dual stick support in games like Super Smash Bros. For 3DS, built-in NFC support for Amiibo, the smaller model can be customized with plates that can be purchased separately and are bundled with some consoles, and it has a bigger screen than the original 3DS, but obviously not as big as the XL. Speaking of which, that leads perfectly into the final revision that also happens to have the most meme-worthy name, the new Nintendo 2DS XL. This model was released in the summer of 2017 in turquoise and orange for $149.99. This model was meant to be a happy medium between the new 3DS models with the same hardware improvements that they introduced there and the original 2DS with its relatively cheap price point. The Nintendo 3DS family is still actively being sold, so this number will notably change by the end of the year, but at the time of recording this video, the Nintendo 3DS's lifetime sales total at 75.08 million units worldwide. Next, the Wii U was released in two different colored SKUs, basic white and deluxe black. The basic model had 8 GB of internal storage and launched without any extra bells and whistles for $299.99. The deluxe model came bundled with stands, a pre-installed game, a membership for their digital game purchase reward program thing, and retailed for $349.99. Aside from that, the Wii U has a tri-core IBM Espresso PowerPC CPU clocked at 1.24 GHz, an AMD Radeon-based Latte GPU clocked at 550 MHz, 2 GB of RAM, and support for up to 32 GB of external storage via SD and or 2 TB of storage via an external hard drive. It's also worth noting that, once again, after the release of the DS and 3DS, Nintendo still stuck with the resistive touch technology for Wii U. Luckily for me, Nintendo didn't release any Wii U hardware revisions because it only sold 13.58 million units worldwide. So this is the part where I just get to tell you to like the video, share it with a friend, and comment down below. Let me know what's your favorite Nintendo hardware release or revision. Also, just for fun, what's your favorite kind of apple? A whole apple, apple pie, applesauce, apple juice? This will serve two purposes. One, it will let me know that you're crazy enough to watch this full video, and also it will confuse everybody else that reads the comments. That's always fun. Be sure to do all the normal stuff I tell you guys to do at the end of videos, ring the bell for more videos like this every Tuesday and Thursday, and follow me on Twitter so you know that when times like this happen that videos are going to be late because they're double the length that I thought they would be, you'll be in the know. Okay, that's it for me. See you next week.